Well, it's going to be fun having an opportunity to have this little panel today. I kind of feel like I'm in some pretty tall clover. I both professionally and physically, I was at lunchtime sitting at a table with Jim here and also Pete and David Checketts, and they're all, you know, at least a head taller than me. Hey, two heads, yeah, they're much taller than me, and I thought, you know, there's a reason I wrestled in high school. Wasn't going to make the high school basketball team, and of course we had John there as well, and I thought, well, at least John and I are the same, and he stood up and I stood up, and he was taller than me, and I'm like, I don't get it, but I didn't get the gene. So where's Ed Shulak? I need some of his medication there. So yeah, let me make a quick introduction. Starting from that end, we have John Cushman, and John. I don't know if you're the current, but certainly the chairman of the board at Cushman and Wakefield, and you can look at his bio. The firm has his name on it. So he spoke last year and it was very wonderful, and we invited him back again this year, and he has a lot that he'll be able to help us with on real estate. Incidentally, yesterday we had a day full of economists here telling us their ideas of the economy and interest rates and inflation and all that. Very, very interesting. A lot of people here have businesses and real estate related to that, so we're all attuned to that. Certainly John and the gentleman up here are going to talk about the practical applications of what all that information, I was going to say nonsense, but economists certainly are not nonsense. They've got to give us the early indicators of what these gentlemen are going to talk about, of how it affects us in real estate and logistics and in operations. So we'll look forward to seeing them. So I know Scott introduced Pete here as Pete. What did you call him? Guarraia? Sorry to call, yeah, but it's Guarraia, right?
Yes, yes.
Is that more correct?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I stayed up all night practicing that. but it's a tough name to say, and I double dog dare you to try to spell it for anyone. He told me it's Italian, right?
That's right.
So.
That's right.
So Pete is with Bain and Company, and you know, I noticed when David Checketts was talking about his early career, his first real job out of college was with Bain and Company. So that's the firm. He's a partner there, and he lives out of Houston, and he'll be talking to us a little bit about logistics and supply chain. And then right here, this big guy next to me, this is James Martell, goes by Jim, I guess. Is that okay?
Please.
So Jim is the CEO of Logistics Property Company, and he'll be talking about global outlook and how it affects us. And we have a significant amount of time. And so what I would like to do is maybe start on that end of the table and give our good friend John an opportunity to maybe spend 10 or 15 minutes and just talk about real estate and how the economics of what's going on, whether we're in a recession or not in a recession, but how it has practical applications to us in the real estate marketplace. So after we do that, then we'll go to Pete, and then we'll go to James.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of visiting with you last year, and I'm delighted to join you again this year. What I can say is a lot has changed since we all visited 12 months ago. From my perspective, America is a mess and the world is a mess. So that has a huge impact on the comments I'm going to make about real estate. But it's a very different environment than when I visited with you last year. And I made the comment last year that so many people get off track talking about real estate because they make generalizations, and you go to a cocktail party and a reception, and somebody always asks me, how's the real estate business? I don't know where to start, because you have to figure out that is it the office space? Is it logistics? Is it retail? Is it multifamily? What is it? Is it, and then you have to ask yourself, is it institutional? Or is it investor grade? Is it the center city? Or is it the suburbs? So you can see that you can make a lot of mistakes by just generalizing on real estate. And I had a conversation last night with Oakley. And I made the comment last year that real estate is a very, very local business. Don't be confused if you live wherever you live, that the application of what you need to know in your market applies to another market. My background has been the high-rise office buildings in major cities across the world. And I've had a chance to do a lot of them and make a lot of mistakes. And the comment I would make is what's happening in Toronto has nothing to do with what's happening in downtown LA. Don't be confused if you're an investor or a developer, you know that you have to dig deep to find out what dramatically differentiates a market. So to get it right, you just have to dissect these markets. You have to do it in a micro way, not a macro way. And as I said, people always generalize about this world. And the answer is, if somebody asks you that question, you need to peel the onion back and try to get to what they really are interested in, because you can't give them a general answer. And what I would tell you is that last year when I spoke to you, I made the comments that the real estate world was robust, not the same. It's a mess. And you get into the question for all of you, whether you're an investor, an owner, is it a new development? Is it an old development? And we spend millions of dollars a year in research on what they call a workplace strategy. That's the key question, the workplace strategy. And the question is, if you're the CEO, I don't care if it's a corporation, institution, professional firm, or the government. And the question is, you need to figure out, do you want your people to come back to work 5 days a week, 3 days a week, 2 days a week? And the bottom line is, I meet with these CEOs at these big companies, and I tell them the only thing certain about that analysis that we'll do and you will do, we'll do it together, is you're going to be wrong. You can't get this right. It's impossible to get it right. And what I will say is that there are key drivers on what these corporations and institutions are trying to do. And they have to be laser focused on three things. Very simple: reduce the footprint, reduce the occupancy cost, and create immense flexibility. I want to focus on the last one, flexibility. I'm involved in one of the largest transactions right now in America. And I don't want to tell you where it is or what it is, but it's all about flexibility. The CEO wants to have, in this case, it's a woman, her cake and eat it too. So she wants the ability before the lease starts to have pre-commencement rights to drop floors. Then she wants the right to be able to have the opportunity to add floors. This is before the lease is started. And then she wants the opportunity, and incidentally, she's right, totally right on these issues. And then they want to know when they can have expansion rights, 5th year, 10th year, and so on. This one particular one's a 15-year lease. And the bottom line of it is, for all of you that own property, if you're a lender, an owner, a developer, an investor, this is not good news. That flexibility is very painful. because you don't know what the income stream is going to be. You model it one way and it comes out another. So there's one thing that's dramatically changed since we were together last year. And that is in my sector, the office sector across America. I don't care where you live, doesn't matter. If it's a US or around the world, there is a gigantic flight to quality. So what does that mean? What it means is, like, I'll give you a specific, New York City. 20% of the major high-rise transactions happening right now are all new construction, and they're getting 80% of the business. So you're going to say to me, okay, what about all the other buildings? Remember, New York City has 411 million square feet, 411. Silicon Valley has 457 million square feet of office space. And the New York number is from Lower Manhattan to Harlem, from the east to the west. And so you're going to ask me, what does quality mean? Quality means the location, the developer. It means the floor size, the floor shape, the dimensions on a floor between the core and the window line. It means the size of the floor. When I started out, you could have 18,000, 20,000 square foot floors. That is not what corporate America, the government, private public sector want. They want 35 to 45,000 square feet. The other thing they want is enormous commitment to systems. All of you probably, some of you work in buildings that are probably antiquated as it relates to mechanical. So the new systems in a new building, like in New York, there are 5 new buildings, 5 new areas. When I started in business, you could be involved on 3rd Avenue, no more. It's all moved west. And it's gone all the way over to the Hudson River. And the Hudson Yards is a gigantic development. It's absolutely unbelievable. And the bottom line of it is the people now want systems where they're getting 100% outside air. I would imagine that 90% of you work in buildings where you're not getting the change of air every second. So it's the architecture, it's the location. And if you don't get this right, there's a problem. So then you're going to ask me, what about those millions of feet in cities across this country that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? They're obsolete. They do not meet what I just said. And there's one cutting edge element that's the biggest driver today and why a corporation or a professional firm makes a move. And that's, I said, they're moving to quality. But the thing that they want more than anything else, think about this, are amenities. So you're saying, what does that mean? That means rooftop access. That means terraces, gardens, outside light. That means wellness centers, great retail. And the older buildings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s don't have that. So if you own one of those buildings today, you're caught in a crossfire where you're going to have to spend billions, not millions, billions on Park Avenue, on Avenue of the Americas, and so on. So maybe I ought to stop there and let you ask the others what they think about this real estate.
Okay,
world.
good. Yes, we'll turn some time now over to Pete. If you want to talk about supply chain and logistics, and then at the end, keep your questions and we'll come back. We'll have time to have some audience participation.
So I'll just offer a few macro comments about supply chain. I think it's a topic that frankly is near and dear to everyone in this room, whether you're trying to buy a piece of meat as Taylor referenced, or trying to build a house or trying to buy a car or what have you. It's been manifestly a problem for the last 2 years for pretty much every American. And let me start my comments in about May of 2020. A partner of mine and I received a call from the State Department, and they asked if we could meet, if we could fly out to Washington and meet with them to talk about supply chain issues, but it was very vague and it was kind of coded, and we said sure. So we went through all the COVID protocols, went to DC, went to the State Department, and we wound up meeting with Mike Pompeo. And the question he asked us was, how fast can the US decouple from China around building semiconductors? And, you know, my partner and I looked at each other and said, well, what are you thinking? And his comment was, can we do it in 3 years? And our reaction was, you'll be lucky to get it done in 15 to 20 years. And the point of that story is what we're going through right now is what I would call deglobalization. You know, at the end of World War II, the US entered Bretton Woods. And essentially what that agreement was we would be the world's policeman. We would provide security on the ocean and be the market of last resort for any country that wanted to trade. And what that allowed for essentially 75 years was the ability of every country and every region to concentrate on doing what it did best. And so you have these incredibly hyper-specialized economies springing up all over the world, by the way, lifting hundreds of millions, if not billions of people out of poverty because they could do what they do best. And it yielded the biggest era of mass prosperity the world has ever known. And what you've seen in the last 10 years or so is the US starting to back away from Bretton Woods and saying, you know what, we're not willing to be the world's policeman anymore. And unfortunately, we saw that in spades in Afghanistan in the August of last year. And the reason why I'm providing all these sort of macro comments is because what happens at a macro level translates into real pain at a micro level. And specifically what I mean is all of a sudden you have countries scrambling for things like food security, for energy security, for raw materials like potash, nitrogen, phosphate, which are critical for agriculture, for semiconductors. And what's interesting is everyone thinks about microprocessors, which are the semiconductors that power your computers. But the reality is what people really should worry about are things like commodities, semiconductors like Zener diodes and thyristors. And the reason why that is because every single electric item in this room, for the most part, has those as elements. And all of this sort of boils down to a few macro points, which are the following. For 75 years, corporations have operated on better, faster, cheaper, meaning I am willing to trade off very long supply chains, very complex supply chains for the lowest source of good and the most consistent source of goods. That yields big world scale factories, whether it's Taiwan Semiconductors or JBS processing meats in Colorado. World scale facilities, very long supply chains, very complex logistics. And as those systems start to break down, what you're seeing, and by the way, they're breaking down for a number of reasons. One is we're having more and more climatological related events. An interesting anecdote is when the tidal wave hit Fukushima, it actually dramatically impacted the luxury car market in Germany. And the reason why that is because the number one manufacturer of very specialty pigments that go into Audis and Mercedes-Benz was wiped out. And so basically a third of production was taken offline because you couldn't make Audis or Mercedes-Benz or Porsches. In any case, the point I'm making now is the trend in supply chain. There are three trends in supply chain right now. One is, how do I build resiliency into my operations? And resiliency could take the form of redundant capacity. It could take the form of cross-training labor. It could take the form of inventory. It could take the form of actually decomplexifying the products you sell. That's one question that management teams are dealing with. The second question management teams are dealing with is transparency. And this is a real issue for a lot of companies, because the fact of the matter is most companies only see their tier 1 or tier 2 vendors. In a globalized world like we used to live in, the reality is most supply chains went 3, 4, 5 vendors deep. And a company like Nike that sources rubber and cotton for their shoes had no idea where the raw material cotton came from. That's important for a variety of reasons. Number one, surety of supply, but frankly, in a world where people start to say, I want to know that my cell phone doesn't have any conflict minerals in it, or I want to understand what the provenance of the steak I'm eating is, or I need to understand that there was or there was sustainable harvest for my coffee. That's becoming increasingly important. So companies are investing in transparency. And the final point I'd make is, as supply chains start to contract, you're starting to see a massive shifting in the world around how do we think about where and how we make things. I'll finish my comments by saying I started my week in Monterrey, Mexico this week, meeting with a variety of wealthy Mexican families that are getting ready to start reshoring production capacity here in North America. And it was interesting. I was listening to comments earlier today about trades for kids that are 18 to 20 to 30 years old as they start to look for jobs. And what I would say is, number one, we in the US are incredibly fortunate. We live in perhaps the best geographic country in the world. We have the largest agricultural plain that's drained by the most navigable rivers. We have a easily defended coastline and borders surrounded by an incredibly fertile center, right? And we're going to start bringing manufacturing capacity back. You're going to start seeing massive amounts of investment. You're already seeing it in semiconductors, but you'll see it in other industries as well. And I think what we're going to continue to see is continued high prices. I think we're going to see, less variety in what you have to buy, less flexibility in what you have to buy, and supply chain problems will still be a problem 5, maybe even 10 years out.
Thanks, Pete. We'll be interested to come back and ask you some questions.
Sure.
Pete just got here a couple hours ago. So he came from Phoenix, where he was 115 degrees, and Lisa can appreciate this, but 115 degrees, zipped over to Houston where he lives, probably 95 degrees temperature and 90% humidity. So to have a little wind here this morning, you're probably enjoying it,
Really
right?
nice, yeah.
Okay, we're going to turn some time now over to Jim and let him talk a little bit about global outlook. So Jim, why don't you take the next 15 minutes and give us some input?
So this is going to get pretty basic. Industrial real estate is very basic. What we provide, what goes inside these buildings that these guys, Bain and Company, advises their customers, is totally different from what we do. But to put it in perspective, I'm exposed to the global beds and sheds industry with my partner out of Australia, Macquarie Bank. So we see what's going on from a coastal perspective, Asia Pac perspective, and technology and so forth. But to bring it home, John talks about the office market, and in the perspective of how big the industrial market is relative to the office market, Chicago has 150 million square feet of office space. Manhattan has 400 million. The industrial market in Chicago is 2 billion square feet. So you got to put that in perspective of how big this industrial market is and how much throughput is running through these markets. If you look at the US market, there's probably 7 of these markets that are these 1.5 to 2 billion square foot. So you got the Northwest, you got LA, Long Beach, into the Phoenix market. Texas by itself is a 2 billion plus market. The Northeast, so you got New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, a couple billion square feet. So you look at these major markets, and why is there such a concentration? There are really 2 things. Population, you got to get the goods to where the people are. And if you look at each one of these segments of the country, there's 60 million plus people living in these markets. The second is, this is where all the throughput is coming. It's coming into the New York harbors, the East Coast harbors, coming into the Texas harbors, coming in by rail, coming into LA Long Beach, down the Lazaro Cardenas in Mexico, up to Port Rupert in Canada. So all the product comes in because that's where the ports are, And that's where it just happens where the population base. So that's the dynamics of why there's such a concentration and where people live and so forth. Transportation is obviously the key element for logistics. So that's the connectivity. 70% of every dollar spent on logistics goes to transportation. 5 cents goes to rent, even though they treat us badly. And it's like they're throwing that nickel around like a manhole cover. It's transportation and it's labor. And so in a company, when Bain is advising a company what to do, the first person out of the car today is human resources. Next person out of the car is transportation. And if you don't meet their objective, you never see the real estate person. They're gone. Over the years, industrial has been very flat, growing 3% a year. Costs have maintained a very consistent, simple model compared to an office building. Might take you 5 to 7 years to go through the development process. Prior to the disruption in the supply chain, John could build 1 million square feet in 5 to 7 years through the process, get it leased up, stabilized, and so forth. I could buy a piece of property, build 1 million square feet, lease it and sell it in 12 months. So you're not exposed. So industrial, from a risk adjusted perspective, you're not exposed to all these elements and third party issues and labor contracts and material disruption, because you had such a very short period of time in which you could execute your plan. What that's done is it's driven the cap rate on these warehouses down in some cases 2%. That's almost, that's over 40 times earnings for you guys that are in the VC business, but 40 times earnings or so drove those investment strategies down because they saw the long-term consistency. Typically our leases are 10 years. So long-term and horizon from a sustainability of income, a low cost of disruption. So if your disruption maybe is a tenant leaves or rolls over, we're moving our office in Chicago, the TIs, commissions, and legal is $200 a square foot. I can roll an industrial building over for $1 a square foot. So we look at CapEx and exposure, you're giving your investment back in the office market, in the industrial market, you got a long-term play. I apologize, I have to read off my phone. My guy sent me because you should be interested in the dynamics of e-commerce and what that did to industrial. So we were tracking along in bricks and mortar retail, pretty much in line until about the first quarter of 2019. And e-commerce was about 10% of retail sales. The separation started in the second quarter of 19, and e-commerce grew to about 60% of retail sales over a period of time. It advanced over 10 years in a very, very short period of time. Obviously, bricks and mortar dropped down to under below 10%. So a huge disparity. And what that did is it drove demand for warehouses. Land being the most volatile portion of any real estate transaction. I can build an office building, warehouse, retail, pretty much everywhere across the country for the same price. So when you're investing in real estate, the volatility is in the land. Land in Inland Empire in 2007, before the recession hit, then land got up to $16 or $17 from about $1 a square foot in 2000. It went back to $5 in 2013. San Bernardino land's trading for $75 a square foot today. If you go into the port cities along the port, $120, $150, $175 a square foot, because of the transportation component of e-commerce. So their companies are evaluating location and labor and transportation, and they're migrating to save that transportation cost because it's 70 cents. They can afford to pay the rent, but they're migrating. So the interesting thing that's happened in the last 5 quarters, for e-commerce is that bricks and mortar retail has exceeded the growth in e-commerce sales. So retail, bricks and mortar retail has gone up, and it's now about just under 14%. And e-commerce, which got as high as almost 17%, is now below the 14.3. So the last 5 quarters, what does that mean? People came out of their houses, right? They stopped buying. They had to go to the mall to get away from the family and the dog and everything. They started going back to the malls and go shopping. So retail sales in bricks and mortar is actually recovering. And I think that's an important consideration. It looks like the penetration of e-commerce will slow and will stay in that 14 to 15% of retail sales through 26 is the estimate. And the bricks and mortar will limp along pretty much in line with where it is. People talk, you probably hear a lot about the Amazon effect. Amazon obviously took over the market for e-commerce, and they were taking about back in 14, 15, they were taking about 20% of the capacity in the marketplace as they started building their e-commerce market. In 2020, they took 85% of the available space in the market. Those are completions of warehouses across the US. They grew from about 300 warehouses to up to over 1,200 warehouses just in the US. So Amazon came out, you all read it in the Wall Street Journal, that they're going to readjust their supply chain. And how's that going to impact? Well, everybody freaked out. They said, well, maybe we're going to give up 5, 10, 20, 30 million square feet. They've given back one building so far that we know of. But in terms of even 30 million square feet, the major markets today, each one of those 7 major markets will probably absorb 25 to 30 million square feet this year. So about 400 million square feet across the US. If Amazon gives away 5 or 10 million, it's a rounding error in terms of the overall. What it did do is it had a shock wave through Wall Street because everybody said, oh my God, e-commerce is dead. What's going to happen? And the impact of that is the public REITs are down 23% from the day that Walmart announced that they were going to resize their platform. Equity REITs are down 16%. So it hit the whole industrial or whole real estate REIT market. The S&P is only down 9. So it was the shock wave that Amazon was going to shrink and slow down e-commerce development because e-commerce was really pulling back fast. What we are seeing today, and I've been in all our major markets here, just was in LA, was in Phoenix. 2 things are happening. Government regulation has dramatically slowed down our ability to proceed with new warehouses. In San Bernardino County, they were trying to push a law through that you couldn't build a warehouse within 1,000 feet of anything. So we really was going to eliminate. You know what happened? All the land in west of Phoenix on I-10, they tied up like 5,000 acres because they thought that everybody in LA would be moving to Phoenix. Well, the law didn't pass. She's going to bring it back again. But so there'll be adjustment there. But so regulation is hurting us. Interest rates are moving up. You all know we moved from LIBOR to SOFR. So SOFR is the security overnight Fed rate from LIBOR. It's pretty much locked in about the same right now. We'll see what happens. The curve though is going to jump. You know, we heard the Fed guy 75, maybe 100. The curve is expected to go up dramatically. Probably the forecast that we saw from our advisors in LA on Monday was probably the first quarter of 24 before it starts to really come back down to where it is today. What that impacts is the negative leverage issues that we face. So if you're a leverage buyer and you're buying your property at a 4 cap or a 5 cap, and you're borrowing at 5.5 or 6, every dollar that you're borrowing is reducing your return on your equity because of that negative leverage of buying below your cap rate. And that's what's really screwing up the capital markets, is that people are really scared about the cap rate and the debt rates really widening here because the cap rates are not moving in lockstep with interest rates. So we're going to see values have to come down. Landowners are going to, as I mentioned earlier, the volatility is in land. So land prices have to come in. Material prices, they're stabilizing. Lumber's come down, steel's come down a little bit. Rubber roofs about the same. They were going up about 2 or 3% a month for a while. So they've stabilized a little bit, but our pricing probably gone up 65 or 70% to build the shell building between concrete, steel, rubber roofs, and then all the piping and plastic pipe and all that come in. Fortunately, rent growth has absorbed those costs. In the what they call the Inland Empire in Los Angeles, typically bumping around 7-8% a year. Last 5 quarters, the rent went up 105%. Across all our markets, we're seeing probably in the mid 20s. It's predicted to come back into the 5 to 7% over the next 3 or 4 years on average. But rent growth has absorbed all these costs, all the government regulations and material costs and issues like that. So some disruption, it's settling back down. We think demand is far exceeding supply yet. There's still 2 or 3 guys lined up for almost every building that could be completed. So we expect that the next 12 to 18 months, the leasing market, absorption market will be strong. Interest rates are going to collapse the capital markets and deals aren't going to be trading. So a little bit of a standstill there. So.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Jim. We're going to open it up for some questions. And looks like Scott Keller here has the first question.
The core of my business is apartments and student housing. People say, hey, Keller, hey, what's up? And I'll say the rent. Well, it's not always good for everyone else. So I have hundreds of millions of dollars of debt. And it's good debt because I think the average of my portfolio is probably sub 3.5% with long-term fixed. The fact is, in maybe the average of 7 years, these 10 and 7-year notes are going to mature. 30-year amortization, 10-year terms or 7-year terms. So there's a corollary with cap rates and interest rates. And today, the cap rates haven't caught up with the interest rate. And at some point, that's got to happen or the trading will stop and the economics don't work. So my concern has always been, so what happens in 7 years from now when the interest rates could rise to 6 or 7 or who knows, something greater? On paper, at least, your equities dry up. But if the note is due, you have to refinance or you have to sell. And what is perceived equity has dried up based on the interest rates. Well, I worry about that, but there's a lot of Scott Kellers in the country. And I can't imagine the Fed driving interest rates that would bankrupt me any more than everybody else throughout the country. So there has to be a sweet spot. There has to be a solution to not put us out of business and keep interest rates, the cost of money, in control that doesn't dry up the economic performance of this multifamily or student housing product. So what would be your comments?
I think you were too young in 1982 to 86, you probably were still in diapers. Federal income tax rate for all of you who weren't there was about 70%. Everything was built on a tax model, tax losses. The feds gave us the right to do 200, 300, 400% depreciation models. No one cared about cash flow. They were all sheltering their 70% income, right? Prime rate was at 21%. We were hooting and hollering. We go to the bank and borrow at 14 to build apartments then. Fed decided they didn't like this program. Yeah, the tax law change of 1986. They put every developer in the country out of business. They formed the RTC. They bankrupted billions of multifamily, student housing, went into the RTC program because you couldn't afford, you couldn't afford to refinance because there was no revenue coming out of those deals. So policy, Fed policy destroyed the real estate industry. And it was Merrill Lynch, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe late 1988 and 89, this guy came up with this concept of bailing out the developers in the country. Let's go public. And really, Merrill Lynch kicked off the rush of real estate investment trusts going public and bailed out every developer in the country. Now they got access to the public capital markets. So I don't think we'll see that again, but that was policy that basically put us into that environment. I think today the rates are not going to probably stay lower. I think that when you look at the curves, you look at the dynamics of where we are, my perspective is that we're not going to go through a hyperinflation on rates. I disagree with the Fed totally in terms of their policy. But I would, at my earliest chance, go to your bank today, extend it as long as you can, do a blend and extend just to protect yourself is one strategy, and see where it goes. But go out as long as you can today.
This is an important question, Scott, and I know it affects a lot of us in the room. So I'd like Pete and John, if you also wanted to respond to that question. John, do you have any comment?
Well, I think the question you asked is way more complicated. I think it's a very delicate balance. And I think our government and our Fed are capable of messing it up. So when you say you think it'll all work out, I don't have as much confidence as you on that question. When all that debt rolls in 7 years, it's going to be a fascinating situation. And I don't know where it comes out. Multifamily, the sector you're in, and we're in every sector in the real estate commercial world. And the number one sector is logistics, number one. And the vacancy rate that he spoke of like 2% in the office business in New York, San Francisco, downtown LA is 20% plus. So the bottom line of it is a lot of this can go wrong. And my prediction is the government's not that great at fixing problems. So we'll see how good it is for you in 7 years. It's the second biggest segment of revenue at our company. We operate 4.8 billion square feet. So we see it all. We see everything. And the third industry, different than yours, is office, which is not great. And the last place is the retail. So your question applies to every one of those disciplines. Every one of those service lines have debt rolling. And I'm not sure how this is going to come out.
One thing the positive thing is over that 7 years, the banks are looking at their debt rate, right? The income over the principal amount of the loan. And over that course of 7 years, if you can keep pushing that rent up, that debt rate will allow them to finance more than they would have if you were flat.
It's not, it's back, well, here.
To eat, and we have to have a place to live, but we don't have to have storage units, and we don't have to have an office. We don't have to have some of these other sectors. We have to eat, and we have to have a place to live. So I've built a multifamily, which is, again, the core of my business, is a need that somehow we'll figure it out. I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've been through a number of cycles. Student housing, students stay in school longer when unemployment is high, and that seems to have its own safety net. But with multifamily, you have to have a job, pay the rent. A good vacancy is better than a bad tenant. So I'm really careful in my business about how to manage that. In 08 and 09, my occupancies dropped, my revenues dropped. We managed operating expenses, midline expenses. I'm not bragging, but we didn't lay one single person off. We pulled everybody together and said, we might have to freeze wages and bonuses and hiring, but we're going to get through this. And for 18 months, we got through that. And with all that said, in multifamily, revenues drop because occupancies drop, but we manage midline expense without going crazy on CapEx issues, new roofs and asphalt, et cetera, remodels. And cash flows went up. Now do the math. So I think that there is the safety net of a good operator in bad times. We learn good habits in bad times and bad habits in good times. And so the focus here is to learn what we've learned in the past experience of bad times. And I think we'll get through it. So I have a little more optimistic view than John, with all due respect. I have a little more optimistic view. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Scott. Looks like we have another question in the back with Tim Harland of Berkshire Hathaway. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tim Harland. I'm in the work for Mr. Buffett in the home services division of Berkshire Hathaway. I've had the pleasure of living in this area for 30 years and raising my boys here. And want to comment and then follow up with a question. Comment. Pete, have you read the book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zehan? Yeah, it talks about.
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Yes, I have.
Anybody here, that's an incredible book. If you're interested in this panel, it's about the globalization, industrialization, and the e-markets and how it's affecting the country and how the U.S. is positioned probably the best in the world moving forward. Okay, that's a comment. Questions, I want to follow up on John's commentary of the flight to quality. I'm going to add a word and have you guys respond to it. So in our area, we see the flight to quality, but here's flight to quality lifestyle. And I'd like to hear how that's affecting your guys' businesses and how you see that moving forward.
Who do you want to direct that to?
I would say that from
Hold on.
working in the office perspective, I've been here 2 weeks. I've been working fine. Didn't drop any productivity as long as the Wi-Fi works. Thank you very much. So I think people, certain elements of can work remotely and work and enjoy the quality of life. So what I see in terms of where people are having trouble from a quality of life standpoint is in the office market is mass transit. People are living in environments where they have consistently traveled through mass transit and they don't want to do it anymore. And so they're relocating either closer to their office or moving to an area where they don't have to take mass transit.
I can make a comment on the quality. It is absolutely the driver in the office sector. Remember, the office sector and the industrial logistics are night and day different. Jim made a comment about the low vacancy rate. I already said in the office sector, it's over 20%. The other comment I would make is that we're seeing a huge pushback on the office sector in the tech world. Huge, not a little bit, but really big. My next door neighbor, where I live in California, which I don't want to be living there too much, but is the #2 at Amazon. They're dropping space like you wouldn't believe. And in New York City, the tech world is shrinking quickly. And that flight to quality is applicable whether in San Francisco, New Orleans, Miami, I don't care where it is. You're absolutely right. And they pay a price, these big corporations, the institutions, even the law firms. That's the way they're headed. The law firms are moving, and they are moving to a lot less space and being asked to do more with less. But they want the quality. That's the #1 objective.
Thank you, Tim. Looks like Tommy here. You have a question?
I do, and this is really for Pete, because you
Okay.
talked about meeting with Pompeo.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're getting into more and more is supply chain provenance, and especially around Space Command, the DoD, et cetera.
Yes.
And so recently we had an incident where there was 32 computers that were pulled out because we found things in those computers
Yes.
straight from the manufacturer. So how is Bain and company, how are you guys advising your clients on that?
Well, it's a great question, and the process of authenticating supply chain provenance is actually reasonably complex. You know, we are working, for example, in the automotive industry, and there are a few supply chains in the world that are more complex than those. And I think you're asking a separate question, which is how do you manage the strategic provenance of your product? And, you know, for certain products like cell phones, computers, that's a separate issue that I think has to have some extra, I think, government investment in. But for companies like, for example, General Motors, what they're doing is understanding, you know, if you think about the provenance of a car, there are probably 30,000 different materials that go into a car. Of those materials, probably about 7,500 actually have really pinch point supply chains. And of those, probably a third, 2,500 are ones that you really need to watch. And so what companies like GM or Ford or frankly, Nike are doing is creating supply chain SWAT teams, which are essentially two things. One is it's an understanding of exactly what are the pinch point products that go into their final product, where they're sourced from. And I'm not talking about tier 1 vendor or tier 2 vendor. I'm talking about tier 3, tier 4, all the way back. And then also putting a set of what they would call early warning indicators in place, right? So is there bad weather in East Asia, right? Are we expecting supply delays? Is there geopolitical unrest in Africa where we're getting our cobalt, you know, things like that, and saying how do we actually build resiliency into our supply chain, whether it's in the form of inventory or dual sourcing and so on and so forth. But it's basically having a strategic plan in place for those few pinch point elements of the supply chain that really matter.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, if you don't, I do have one for Jim here. I wouldn't mind if you wouldn't mind speaking to automated trucks. I mean, we're going now to a future where automation is taking over. We got drones. We could have drone delivery, remote driving vehicles, delivery of products and services. Maybe not so much services, but through trucks. And do you want to speak to that?
It's an interesting environment out there. A lot of people are trying to figure out. I think it was in 20 or 21, people were forecasting that we'd all be in driverless vehicles by 22, 23. I don't think that's happening. The truck is a much more simpler logarithm. If you leave Denver and end up in Chicago, there's no stoplights, right? All you're worried about is some few cars in front of you, maybe a deer running across the road, but there really isn't any. So the logarithm is very easy versus being the corner of Madison and Fifth Avenue in New York, where there's 1,000 things that could happen. So you're trying to build a logarithm for that car to adjust to a whole different menu of issues for a truck. They're testing them. They're testing them between Tucson and Phoenix right now. So they're on the road. There already are, we'll call trains. They're locked. They're trucks. They're locked in by GPS with a driver in the front truck and nobody in the back trucks, and they're pulling across 70 or 80 with a lead driver, and he's pulling two other trucks by GPS. The issue becomes loading and unloading at each end, and because these warehouses are not timed perfectly for a truck to come in and just back up to a dock. Today, because of the volume of throughputs, you're a time slot. And if you miss that time slot for whatever reason, you could sit for 24 hours because all the time slots are already booked. So the one model that I saw that I thought had the most authenticity was you'd have a driver take that truck from the warehouse to a staging area. You flip the switch, he jumps out, and it goes from, let's say, DIA to O'Hare Airport. Then a driver jumps in, flips the switch, and takes it to the warehouse. That way, that the most difficult part of each end is managed by a driver. The simple part of just going 70 miles an hour down 70 is pretty easy. The bigger thing they're struggling with is theft. What do you do with this truck if some guy knocks it over on the freeway? So I think they got to figure that out and what the safety factors are and what they're going to do about it. But so far, no one seems to concerned about the theft issue. They're just trying to solve the truck driver issue because we're short of 80,000 truck drivers today. We don't know, these truck drivers all want to be short haul. No one wants to be a long haul driver, spend their life on the road. So we're trying to figure that out. The policymakers should have started building truck drivers a long time ago. We've had the same issue for 20 years. We've had a shortage of truck drivers. So we're going to get autonomous vehicles. I think trucks will be more prevalent than cars on a relative basis. Drones, you can imagine, see 50 drones flying around here. I think the consumer is not going to accept drone traffic with the noise and infringement on their life with drones. So Amazon and Walmart are trying to push it as hard as they can. I think you could see if you're living out, 150 miles from the nearest post office where they could send one drone out there once a week or something, but and for medical purposes, that might work. But I don't think anybody in Teton Springs is going to be satisfied with hundreds of drones flying around here dropping diapers off. Or I've mentioned that, yeah. So I think autonomous trucks are here. They're already on the roads. The GPS locked in trains are on the road already, and we'll see how fast it ramps up.
Thank you.
Can I,
Go ahead. Yeah,
so the only other thing I would add is there's been a question that's been kicked around outside of autonomy in trucks and cars around robotics, and everyone's talking about automation and what's the future of automation. And one of the things we're seeing a lot of is not necessarily deployment of robots per se, but what we're seeing a lot of is cobots, which are rapidly programmable robots that work in tandem with a human to do a job. And what's going to be a big driver of cobotic deployment sort of across the country is the fact of the matter is you can deploy a cobot with a low-skilled worker and turn that low-skilled worker into a very high-skilled worker at a much lower cost. And so whether it's welding or assembly or other sort of complex manufacturing tasks, you can actually attach a reasonably cheap robot to a reasonably cheap human being and turn them into a very expensive asset.
I had I also wanted to follow up with one comment that Pete made when he was in Monterey about onshoring. Engineering News Record just published their 12-month numbers. First time in decades where we had $100 billion of construction just in the manufacturing industry alone. Just in manufacturing, 100 billion. We haven't seen those numbers. Their other papers are talking about 80% of the Fortune 1000 are in the process of onshoring some manufacturing. You go to Phoenix, I've been to Monterey as well. They can't handle it. It's just Phoenix is exploding with manufacturing. And so you're going to see, from our perspective, it's picking up the Amazon effect. As Amazon slows down, e-commerce slows down. We're seeing the advent of manufacturing absorbing the industrial buildings.
Thank you. Question over here.
Jim, one of the things you mentioned was yesterday you were talking about so much onboarding coming into the United States and huge manufacturing, like you were talking about coming into the United States. And our Federal Reserve Governor was talking about controlling inflation at the same time not killing employment. With the automation that's going into the factories that you're seeing now with increased manufacturing here in the United States, how much do you think the lack of the number of, the reduction in the number of employees that are needed in these manufacturing plants will impact employment going forward in that sector? In the manufacturing sector, how will that be impacted? And how do you think that will coincide with what our Fed governor said about employment?
4 years ago, I took a trip with our partners through Asia and Asia Pac, Australia up through China and into Vietnam's. The US is so far behind in robotics and technology and warehousing. Even in China, I went to the Land Rover Jaguar, all automated. They still had a lot of people standing around, but the process was all, excuse me, all automated. Multi-story buildings over there. You didn't see a forklift operator. They all were autonomous forklifts. So we're catching up. As those manufacturers bring that onshoring, they're accustomed to technology, because when they're in China, when they're in Vietnam, and though there's low labor rates, they're there's a lot highly evolved technology that they're using already, and they're going to come here and expect that. So I don't think they're going to see the massive labor increase for these companies onshoring. It's like anything else, it's like jelly. You squeeze it, it's going to come out someplace else. There's a lot. We have 10 million jobs. So we got to retrain people, right? If you lose them from a warehouse perspective, let's retrain them, go through the system. So the Fed and the administration needs to be hearing from the Fed that we're going to unemploy people. We got to start retraining them, because we do have, if you look at the one is, there's 10 million jobs going unfilled today.
Do we have any other questions? Rob, Ryan? The question was, who are the leaders
in the
in
companies that are
cobot?
making cobots? That's a good question. I'm trying to remember the name of the German company. There was a German company that was unfortunately bought by the Chinese about 6 years ago. That was frankly the #1 company in the world in terms of building robotic automation and cobots. In general, the Germans tend to do very well in that space. They build industrial machinery, otherwise machines that make machines. And so most of the leaders are in that space. There are a variety of tiny startups in Silicon Valley that are also getting after it. And a lot of what they're doing is trying to develop easily programmable cobots. So instead of writing code, what the robot will do is scan a worker doing the job and then mirror that worker's motions. And so, if you're interested in investing in that space, what I would strongly suggest is just looking at the long list of startups in Silicon Valley. And there are a variety of things, whether it's motion or precision metrology, and probably autonomy are the three big themes I would look for in robotics.
Belgian, I should have mentioned this, good example. I was in a liquid manufacturing plant, and it's really an assembly plant in LA the other day. They moved into a new facility that was 600,000 square feet. They were one of the, trying to think of the brand, I won't mention the brand, but they were processing 900 million cans of drink. they would test every can. It was 2,000 cans a minute to go through a photo system. When the plant is up and running, 60, 70 billion cans they're going to produce in this plant. They went from 500 people to 20.
Yeah.
And it was all German engineering where this company came over, and all the photometrics, and they take the can, the top, and the liquid, and it just, you can't even see it. It goes so fast. And so that, that technology and that stuff is, again, I think it's going to,
Great, thank you. So we're going to conclude it, but before we totally give them a round of applause, I wanted to just take the opportunity while I still got the microphone, which is not very often. They don't let me out of the office very often. But I wanted to make sure on behalf of Scott and consequently myself, make sure we thank a few people, including Justin and Cody. Justin and Cody. And Lexi, I don't want to dismiss Lexi as well, because she really runs this place now. We just kind of do whatever she tells us to do. But Justin and Cody had the vision for the Bronze Buffalo Club, 15 years ago, and started building the club before we had this facility here. And they were working over in Star Valley and built this wonderful club, and of course invited Scott in by 2018, and consequently myself. And so the vision and the culture that we have here and that we have here today, and why I'm wearing this little cowboy hat, is because of the culture that they've created. It was interesting at lunch a few moments ago, an hour ago, that we were all sitting together eating, and John, who happens to be a member of Tributary and here, he was telling me a few of the differentiating factors about the two clubs, and he was giving us props, and it made me proud. And not that I would pat myself on the back, because it goes back to Justin and Cody and the culture that they started. And he was talking about, here we have a culture, and that culture permeates to all of us, and has created an environment where we can interact like that. And that's, what he relishes. So I hope I quoted that properly, John, but it goes back to that culture. Now, all of you are involved in businesses and jobs, and you understand all the moving parts that go on. I've been involved in lots of businesses over the last 35 or 40 years, but there is none that I've been involved with that has as many moving parts as this does. We have retail, we have food and beverage, we have, amenities and activities and seminars and trade shows. So anyway, it's a big moving project, and Justin and Cody somehow keep it all together, keep us sane. And I wanted to formally thank them and Lexi. So once more, let's give it up to them. One other thing I wanted to say, I wanted to go a little deeper than even Justin and Cody, because we have this culture and this club, but we also have these wonderful facilities, and these wonderful facilities here were developed by Tony and Sandy Vest and a couple of partners back here sitting over here. And I wanted to publicly thank them as well, because we're sitting in facilities that we own, because they decided to hand the baton off to the Bronze Buffalo Club. And there were some developers that started this project before you, right, Tony? And then you guys bought it out. Was it like 2002 or something? Okay, they weren't having fun, and it's probably because they weren't making money. That's code word for, right, Tony? So Tony and Sandy and their partners took over and built this thing, and then sold the club to Justin and Cody and the Bronze Buffalo Club in 2014, I believe. And so it was a blessing that they decided to hand the baton off. And we've been buying still properties and facilities here at Teton Springs from them ever since. I think we got about everything from it, don't we, Tony? Okay, well, we want you to know how much. I was talking to Tony yesterday, and he was just telling me a little anecdotal story that I was not aware of, but he was saying that right before they had the contract and right before they were ready to close on it, that Sandy, his wife there, Sandy, aren't you an attorney? Okay, but she found in the contract that this property and their purchase didn't include the water rights. Okay, so I want everyone to look over here at these beautiful ponds that have fish in. Some of you, I know David Checkers was fishing there last night, and we enjoy it. And I don't want us to take it granted for these 26 ponds that are on property and the 4 springs that we have coming up out of ground over here. But had Sandy not caught that, we wouldn't have water rights. So there's I want to give a big shout out to Sandy and Tony and their confidence in being able to, and having a confidence in selling to the Bronze Buffalo Club and remaining part of the Bronze Buffalo family. So thank you, Tony and Sandy, and to your partners, who I'm not sure if are here. Okay, with that said, let me also thank the panel formally, John and Pete and Jim, for being here today and giving us some insight as to the things that we talked about. Thank you very much.